First of all, welcome. Thank you. I so appreciate you making time for this conversation. And I don't like to, I'm not one of those people who likes to read the person's bio because I'm like, why am I reading your bio? You can tell your story better than I can. So why don't you start by introducing who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Tamara Mariam Dawit. I'm a Ethiopian Canadian, and I've worked across a lot of art forms. So I started in the music industry. I worked with spoken word poets in theater and dance. And then really primarily for the last 10 years, I've just been working in film, both as a director and producer. And for me, regardless of what the art format is, they've all been opportunities for me to tell stories. And generally, in my artistic practice, I try and focus on the stories of women and the stories of voices from Eastern Africa.
Where did that love of story come from?
I think reading. I mean, I grew up from a very young age with my mother reading to me, and that tradition of, reading. And I think for most of my life, I've been reading as a child, probably a few books a week. And as an adult, maybe like a novel a month or one or two. So I think consuming content, story content, whether it's books or podcasts or films, has always been an important part of my schedule.
So you said you referenced that you love telling stories. You love particularly the stories of women and East African women. Why East Africa?
Because my family is Ethiopian, so I feel like the narrative that most people have outside of Ethiopia about Ethiopia is one of two things. It's one, information about famine because of its sort of the negative stain left by this Band-Aid fundraising activism in the 1980s, or the other information I find a lot of people have in the Black, Caribbean, and African community is about the emperor, and the emperor was, so wonderful and all these great things he did as an African leader. But I think, both of those only give you a very small portion of the country. So I'm really interested in helping other aspects of history and other points of views be told internationally.
So you specifically said that you love film. What is it about film that drew you? Why film? Because there are many mediums that you could use for storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think I got into film because I was working in international development, and a thing called YouTube was invented or launched. And suddenly it was going to be easier for us as an organization to put video content explaining our work online. And one of the things that I realized, very quickly in doing communications, that this sort of old format of corporate videos with talking heads saying like, our work is so good because of this, isn't interesting and no one wants to watch that. But we can actually take some of the stories that were traditionally told by NGOs through articles and case studies, and those can be made into films. And it's much more interesting. There's a stronger connection, and it's more engaging for people to be able to see live in action through a video, the issue or the person you're trying to introduce them to. So that for me was really how I got into filmmaking. And I think, to this day, when I look at a topic that I want to produce content on, I really look at it from the angle of what is the best format for this piece of content to reach the most people or to reach the audience that I want to reach.
So you talked about using film as a medium to introduce people to someone. Or your most recent film that has done phenomenally well is playing at all these major festivals, is one that is very personal. Can you tell me about that film and why you made it?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a film I was expecting to make. Even when I found out that I had this aunt that no one talked about, I was sort of focused on a separate project. But I was really intrigued to try and unpack like why and how could there be a member of the family that no one had spoken about and thus I didn't know about. Why has this happened? I realized that this is something that's affecting a much sort of broader cross-section of Ethiopian society, this idea of collective silence. So I wanted to make this film to sort of dig into that, and then also use it as an opportunity to explain to people, both in Ethiopia, younger populations here, and internationally, about what happened in the 1970s and why the emperor was actually overthrown, and about the injustices under the dictatorship that took over after him.
And why was it? Like, what did you find out in the making of this film about why there was this silence in your family, why you didn't know you had this aunt?
I mean, I think there's two sides to that. There's one, I think it's important to realize that during the military dictatorship, it was illegal and dangerous to mourn someone who had passed away because they were opposing the government. That would mean that you too could be seen as someone who was opposing the government, which would be dangerous. And these were not people who you should be honoring. So that's also why my family and many families, like you wouldn't tell someone that their relative had passed away because they would immediately want to enter into this large mourning and funeral production, which would be dangerous. So I think when you're told you're not allowed to do something, then it just becomes habit. And I don't think that my family was purposefully hiding her. I think it just became a habit to not talk about her. Plus, it was painful. So when things are painful, you can also try and suppress them.
What surprised you in the making of this film? Like, was there anything that you found out about your aunt, who she was, that surprised you about her?
I mean, I think that the initial information I got about Sally was from the perspective of my aunts. And I realized very quickly that they really only had a small sliver of the picture. And they really only knew information that people had told them. They hadn't perhaps pushed, and they had not maybe have been, they hadn't done their own investigation to this extent because it was going to be difficult for them to do it. So I was better positioned to do that. And I think my aunts really saw Sally as someone who, worked as a nurse and was sort of doing these like things you assume women do in the time of war. And she was also involved in political ideology. But for me, going through and doing this project, I found out that, well, yes, she did those things, but she was also involved in what, the government at that time would consider terrorism in terms of bombing and assassination attempts. She received military training. She had a gun with her when she was going underground. And that, the involvement was, to me, much deeper and much more dangerous than how my aunts had perhaps painted the picture.
And what's your family's response been to, first of all, you finding out all this information that maybe they didn't know? And then second of all, you putting this effectively out into the world for all of us to see and to know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, when I first started poking around and asking questions about Sally, one of the first people I talked to was my grandmother. And my grandmother, it had never occurred to her that I didn't know. And then she sort of digested that information and came back to me and said, if you don't know about this, it means that other people in our family and other young people here probably don't know about the values, the vision, and the sacrifice that Sally and other young people made in the 1970s. And that's wrong, because if we don't know about our past, we can't learn from it. And we can't also be inspired to affect similar change today. So that was sort of the directive that came from my grandmother that sort of, I think, pushed everyone to participate because she had said, we need to do this to remember her. And in terms of, their responses, I don't know so much because, we're all isolated. And we haven't had the opportunity to watch the film together, and people have watched it also on their own. So I think it'll be a bit different in a few months once we can gather and have a screening where everyone's there.
What are some of the other stories? I know you have, first of all, an impressive lineup of things that you are working on, and then even more impressive lineup of things that you have put out into the world. Like, what have been some of the other projects that you've worked on, and what was the inspiration for you to pursue those projects?
I think similar to this, most of the projects I've done have some sort of social justice or human rights angle to them. Something that I want to dig into, something that people don't know a lot about. So one of the projects that I have a documentary I'm working on now is about a massacre that happened in Ethiopia just prior to World War II when the Italians had occupied the country, and why that happened and why there haven't been any sort of repercussion for the Italians in relation to that. And part of my interest in doing that was finding out about the Ethiopian freedom fighters within the capital that were trying to remove the Italians. And then the other side also realizing that young people in Italy today have no idea that this happened. And so it's, for me, it's sort of to give Ethiopians here pride in, we stood up and these are the things we did, but also on the Italian side, to be able to look back at that moment in history and reflect on what happened and what can we learn from that.
Now, going back to the documentary Finding Sally about your aunt, I haven't watched it. As I was telling you at the top, it was one of the films that I was so looking forward to seeing at Hot Docs, and hopefully it will be. Do you know whether, because I know Hot Docs is releasing some of the documentaries as online for you to be able to consume them online. Do you know if yours is one of those?
Yeah, I can tell you what happened with Finding Sally with Hot Docs. It was actually part of a TV broadcast with the CBC, which was back on April the 30th, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. It was really bad to not be there at the festival, to be with people, to get their reactions, but the TV broadcast was also in prime time, and I think it replaced like Hockey Night in Canada. So a lot of people were watching it because people were at home more than probably would have watched it at some other time. And then the film is up on the CBC Gem website until the end of April. So, of course, that's geo-blocked to Canada. But I think that's been really helpful because we've been able to push people there, especially the Ethiopian and Eritrean communities in Canada, that I really want them to have access. And then the film is also part of the festival selection for Hot Docs Online, which I believe starts on May the 28th. So that's geo-blocked to Ontario. And then there's another festival in BC later in June, which will be geo-blocked to British Columbia.
Okay, so I'll have to try and catch it in one of those places. One of the things as I was researching and, I watched the trailer, what was so beautiful in the trailer was the music. Tell me about how you went about commissioning the music, why that music?
Yeah, when I was doing my research and learning about the EPRP and thinking about Sally in the very, very early stages of working on the film, a friend of mine who's a musician, Zaki Ibrahim, had a concert in Toronto. And I went to the concert and she was sort of testing out new music. And I came from this bubble of like thinking about Sally and went to this concert and was like, no, this is the voice of Sally. So I've always imagined the film as being very musical. It's much less musical in the end than perhaps I would have originally envisioned. But I really worked with Zaki to give a voice to Sally through the film. And I also wanted to use her voice as an instrument, because usually film score is like piano and strings and drums and these sorts of things, but I wanted to try and do something different. And that for me was like the most exciting part of the process was, to be here in Ethiopia with Zaki, with the Ethiopian musicians and working on the music.
How long did it take you to make this film?
I started on the film, I think in like 2014. And from 2011 to then was more when I was just researching and trying to track people down and trying to determine like what is the shape of this thing and what can it be and how can it take form.
And what's been your I know the world as it is right now has kind of taken away, perhaps, like you said, the opportunity for you to experience the film with other people. But aside from being able to do that, what's been your proudest moment in the making of this film?
I think the thing that's maybe the most recent and the most that I'm most happy about is just the messages that I've been getting from young Ethiopian and Eritreans in Canada and some people in other parts of the world who somehow managed to get around the CBC's geo-blocking, really sending me messages saying, thank you for doing this. I didn't know about this, or I watched it with my parents and found out about how they were affected. So for me, it's that sort of stirring of intergenerational conversations. But I've also been getting messages like that from, people from the Middle East, people from Southeast Asia, other parts of Africa that have similar pain or baggage within their own families.
What did you learn about yourself in the making of this film?
One, I'm very patient, but maybe because making a film takes a really long time. And I think, maybe the more recent thing was just learning, through the experience of COVID that, even though you have plans and schedules and everything sort of ironed out, you have to be able to shift and change things quickly. And being able to manage that and sort of realign your expectations and be okay with it was sort of a big learning curve.
So you talked about film being challenging and that you have to be patient. And I know making a film is challenging. What was your biggest challenge in the making of Finding Sally?
I think for me, my challenge is, that the film was completely financed in Canada. And to finance a documentary in Canada, you need to have access essentially to the broadcasters. You have to have access in terms of having a track record of having produced another feature film in the past. So I realized really quickly that because all of my credits were, television and shorts and things that basically, as a woman of color, it's harder to break into the industry to get those bigger credits. So I think for me, that was the biggest challenge was negotiating, well, which white gatekeeper do I have to work with to get the access? And then how, no matter how well-meaning white people can be, they're not going to get some of the emotional chords of the film. In my experience as a person of color trying to make a film, which was the first film made about Ethiopians in Canada and representing the whole community. So there's those difficulties, which I know a lot of other racialized creators deal with in Canada and also in other countries. It's sort of the balancing of the audience, my interest to make a film for Ethiopian and African audiences, and the producer and the funder's interest in making a film for white Canadians, and how can those two meet in the middle?
What advice would you give to a woman of color, or particularly someone from the African community who's looking to make film? Like what's your biggest piece of advice to someone who identifies that way?
I think it depends on where you're based and what funding systems, you have available. Part of what I do in Ethiopia through my production company is specifically to work with Ethiopian directors as their producer to act as the buffer between them and the foreign producers who are probably going to be white, so that there's at least someone there as the go-between to negotiate on behalf of them, so that they don't have that additional burden on their shoulders as the director. But I think it's, for me, being a filmmaker and trying to access the funding systems in Canada means spending part of my time being an activist and asking these questions and pushing for changes, because there's been a lot of changes in terms of access to financing for women. But if you look at who's benefiting from this financing, it's primarily white women. So then again, pushing back and lobbying further to say this needs to be further diversified.
And in terms of what you're doing next, how have you been able to fund your project?
Well, the next projects we have a number of them that are all in development or in pre-production, and everything is stalled because of COVID. And it's hard to even know when things resume if the same co-production setups can actually function, if the same funds, especially like the European funds, will have the same amount of money in their budget next year as they had last year. So it's kind of like a holding pattern. But I've really been looking at, I think you can't rely on going to just one pot. You have to diversify. So with some projects, if the director has an African passport, there's certain things that they can access that I can't access as someone with a Canadian passport. And I think it's also important as a producer to make sure you have projects that are going out at the same time that aren't all going to the same funder. I'm not going to produce 5 documentaries in the same year and try and sell them all to the CBC. That's not likely. It might be better to have one that I would try and sell to a broadcaster in Canada and one that has, a different focus.
And what for you has been as a woman in film, what's been beyond time, beyond money, what else has been difficult? I had a conversation with a filmmaker. She made a beautiful documentary in Malawi, and she was telling me how being perceived, being a woman in and of itself was difficult in terms of getting access to people or people taking you seriously in the industry. Has that been a challenge for you?
Not that much. I mean, I did have one experience on a project where the cinematographer just decided he wasn't going to listen to me. I don't know if that was because I was a woman, if that was ageism, if it was racism. I mean, I don't know what it was. And I think that those sorts of issues are a little bit less in documentary than they are in dramatic filmmaking. And I mean, I think I haven't really had challenges with access, specifically because most of what I've been working on lately is in Ethiopia. I can show up and say, I'm an Ethiopian and this is my specific connection to that issue or person or question or whatever it is. But I think it can be difficult to get access if you come in from somewhere else as an outsider and are saying, I'm interested in this issue. And people will say, well, why? And who are you? And why should you be the one telling this?
What are you seeing in terms, I mean, obviously COVID, has put a damper on everything at the moment. But what were you seeing in terms of the industry in Ethiopia? Is it a growing industry? Who are the kinds of people who are making films in Ethiopia? Because you referenced that you've co-produced films with Ethiopian filmmakers.
Yeah, I mean, the industry here is really green, but there's also a lot of content coming out. So I think it's very similar to Nigeria or even to India, perhaps, 10 or 15 years ago, that there's a huge domestic film industry that is, what we would consider in the West as, low budget, low production quality films, but they actually are returnable because people want to watch content in their own language and with actors from their own country. I tend to not get involved in that aspect of the industry, and I mostly work with filmmakers that have content that we're going to do a much longer production process on. We're going to finance it internationally as well as in Ethiopia and make sure that the film has a release plan for Ethiopia, but also a release plan for the rest of the world.
Now, switching to you personally, coming into 2020, what were your biggest goals?
I mean, one, the release of this film. So I was really expecting to be spending the spring and summer traveling with Finding Sally. So I had sort of cleared a part of my schedule because I figured I'd be living out of my suitcase. And then also working on a film that's in development, that I'm in a lab in Europe for producers. So I was really expecting to be not home. So it is an adjustment to be at home, but I think, that's part of the readjustment and the pivoting process. And I've just sort of said, like, those things will happen, but they'll happen maybe next year or a bit later. And I've just sort of refocused to use this time to work on other stuff that I wouldn't be able to do if I was traveling.
Now, you talked about being home. Where is home for you right now?
Well, home right now, my only physical house is in Addis, because normally when I'm in Canada, I'm moving between different cities or visiting different people. So I don't have a physical house anymore in Canada with my stuff. But I mean, even before COVID struck, all of 2019, I was traveling. So for me, home is like where my laptop is, where my husband is, where my suitcase is. It's a fluid idea.
Now, you grew up in Canada and then moved to Ethiopia as a grown-up. What was it that prompted the move?
I think it was really two things. I mean, I had been coming here a lot to do research, to do other projects. And when I made the decision to, that Finding Sally started to get development money, and I knew that, this is going to happen, this is going to be a long-term commitment, I looked at my life in Canada and realized that I was working full-time to afford to be in Toronto, and that directing this film, the amount of money was going to be minimal. So I actually then realized, on the one hand, I can't afford to make this movie and stay in Canada, because if I'm working full time, I won't have enough time to focus. And on the other hand, I wanted to spend more time in Ethiopia to do more research, to be closer to the characters and immerse myself in the place I was making the film about. So it was a mix of a creative decision and also a financial one.
What are you most excited about? I know the world has kind of been turned upside down, but what are you most excited about right now?
I think, so since this COVID stuff started, I optioned a book that I want to adapt into a film, and we've signed another Ethiopian director that has a feature film at a very, very early stage. So now I'm working with two directors, and that's the thing that's sort of most exciting to me, is the process of going back and forth with them on the script and the story ideas and that sort of creative process.
What would you say, since we're all in the time of COVID, what's been the greatest gift that this time has given you?
I think that it's sort of forced you to stop and slow down and focus. So I think in like the first week of being grounded, I don't know that I did that much. I actually was panicking a lot because I was dealing with this realignment, and then also I spent too much time looking at the news, and I realized like you can't watch the news. But I think this sort of stopping, realigning, planning was good for me, because I'm going to turn 40 in a month. So I started doing this process of like, what is the next decade going to be about? And also a lot of like company planning work, which led to me picking up these two new projects.
And what brings you what are you most afraid of actually right now? What are you most afraid of?
I think it's the financial impacts, because as a production company, like we make a huge amount of our income from working in co-production. So that relies on like foreign crews coming into Ethiopia or doing production support for other people's projects that are shooting here. So when this happened, we lost all of our work up until August. I don't know if there's going to be any work happening in the fall. So that sort of more, I guess the small stress, or the thing that will become the bigger stress, is cash flow, and how do we stay afloat when there's no money coming in.
What brings you the most joy right now?
I think it's, the amount of family time that we're having, because, prior to this, it was when we're in the same place and having date nights or having dinner nights at home. But now it's much more often that we have breakfast together every day, or that we have dinners together, or that we're hanging out at night and doing movie nights. Whereas before, there just wasn't enough time to do that.
And what are you most grateful for?
I mean, I think that we're all healthy. And even though I'm separated from my family in Ethiopia and in Canada, so far everyone is still in good health.
And what do you love most about yourself?
I mean, I think the thing that keeps me going is my ability to organize and to plan. And maybe that's like a boring thing to love about yourself, but that means I can keep on top of stuff and schedule myself and do the things I want to do, but also not get behind.
And I love what you said at the beginning, that you really want to tell the stories of Africa. You really want to tell the stories in particular of women from East Africa. What's the impact that you want to have?
I mean, I think that maybe that also comes from my work in international development, that a lot of the comms work we did was about giving a platform for the voices of the vulnerable and those who you don't often hear from. And that's something that's followed me into my creative process. So in Ethiopia, that means, women and young people, and also, members of society that you don't often get to hear from because they're not in the mainstream.
Where can people find you? Where can people find more information about the work that you're doing, the films that you're working on?
Yeah, so for Finding Sally, the website is findingsally.com. And that's probably the best place for people to keep in touch with that project and to find out when there'll be either TV broadcasts or festival online screenings in other territories. And then my main production company is called Gobez, and that website is gobez.ca.
And why is it called that?
That was actually completely by accident. I wanted to call my company another name with the word G. And after many weeks of trying to register the company in Ethiopia, I went into and stood in this line with this guy that was going to approve the name, the business name on the license. And he said, oh, you can't have that name. But here are the other names under G. And I didn't want to have to restart and wait in all these lines. So I looked, and Gobez was a word that I recognized and I knew what it meant. And that's how I chose it. But it's good that I chose it because Gobez is something in Amharic you say to someone to encourage them or to congratulate them for, like, you know, winning a battle or a race or doing well on a test. So it's sort of something every Ethiopian wants to be Gobez, so it works well.
Oh, that's how fortuitous that that's the name. That's incredible. It's been such a joy speaking to you. Thank you so much. I'd love for you, I ask every guest who comes on to finish the sentence because this platform is called Ndini, and Ndini in my mother tongue means I am, and is really, what do you say you are? So if I asked you to finish the sentence, I am, what do you say?
I think I'd say I am Gobez.
Thank you. For me, I mean, with this platform, my intention was to tell the stories of women, and in particular African women, because I'm from Zimbabwe. And so I'm so grateful to you for giving voice to our stories. I appreciate you for that.
Thank you so much for spending time with me.
Here's what I'd love to ask you as our community. So I want to know from you, who do you want me to have on the show? Who would you like me to interview? Who are some of the amazing women whose stories you would like for us to share on this platform? If you have any fantastic ideas, and even better, if you can connect me with them, please comment, leave your comment, or DM me and tell me who are some incredible stories I should be sharing on this platform. And the other ask that I have of you is for you to subscribe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook, and share. Please share. If you find any of our interviews inspiring, please share them with your friends and family.